Welcome everyone to the second episode of Wellness Talk with Dr. K. Today I'm very excited to have my good friend Mark Surdut, aka the Nutritionist, with us. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So today we're going to start a little bit in terms of a discussion about inflammation. Now, inflammation isn't necessarily a bad thing because we need to have an inflammatory process in order for our immune system to work, for health to happen, and for growth. But when inflammation becomes chronic, that's when disease strikes. And chronic inflammation is linked to cardiac disease, to cancer, to Alzheimer's. So we're going to ask Mark to talk a little bit about inflammation in the gut and how it affects our health. And also he's going to give us tips and tools to improve our health. So Mark, if I could hand over to you to start. And I think people don't often make the correlation between, gut health and inflammation. And so if you could just speak to that to start.
Yeah, and I'm excited that you came up with this particular topic for this podcast, because I think it's also a great way to introduce something I'm passionate about, which is healthy eating.
Yes.
But isn't this a nice way to kind of enter into healthy eating, to not just look at the food pyramid or the food plate, but to actually show people that the basis of many illnesses and disease states is inflammation.
Yes.
And as you rightly pointed out, just to go back one step, there is acute inflammation, which as a dental surgeon, you'd be very familiar with, more familiar than myself, something that you probably are actually exposed to and see and deal with on a daily basis. Inflammation is a natural response to injury. It has, however, an evil cousin. And this evil cousin is chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is connected to a whole range of diseases, including something else that I'm passionate about, as you know, which is mental health. And we discovered some time ago that there's a style of eating which is anti-inflammatory. Right. By the way, there's a style of eating that is also pro-inflammatory. Now, I think some of us know the pro-inflammatory nasties that we include in our diet. Sugar or refined carbohydrate being probably the #1 villain. But there are other pro-inflammatory foods which we can maybe touch on as well. But I'd like to probably focus more on the positive side of nutrition and focus more on an anti-inflammatory approach. So yes, there is something called an anti-inflammatory diet or an anti-inflammatory way of eating. Now, a lot of people, in fact, are probably familiar with the term the Mediterranean diet.
Yes. And
the Mediterranean diet, of course, as you and I know, is essentially, if you think of some of the ingredients of a Mediterranean diet, it is almost synonymous with an anti-inflammatory diet. But I'm happy to explain some of the, to break it down a little bit further for people and explain that connection in a little bit more detail.
Fantastic. So, we were discussing earlier about the microbiome as well. Could you just explain for the audience just exactly what the microbiome is and how it affects our health and functioning?
Yeah. Well, when I trained in the previous century, same as you, when we trained in the previous century, when I went to dietitian school, there wasn't even such a term, right? Yep. We spoke about the gut flora. I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that, yeah.
The term used was the gut flora, and so what are we talking about when we talk about the microbiome or the gut flora? We're talking about the bugs, specifically the bacteria that colonize our gut. And particularly, we're referring to the bacteria that colonize the large bowel, the large part of the intestine, also known as the colon. And that is where a lot of food lands up getting digested. The contents of our food, most of our food is digested between the stomach and the large bowel. And a lot of digestion and absorption of nutrients from the gut into the bloodstream takes place in the small intestine. But anything that isn't dealt with effectively from a digestive perspective in the small bowel then lands up, of course, in the large bowel.
Yes.
And in the large bowel, the way we break things down is not through peptic acids and other things that might be churned out by the stomach, for instance, and other enzymes that are maybe that enter the small bowel and help to digest various components of our food. In the large bowel, what finds its way into the large bowel is broken down by bacteria,
Right.
and that is the microbiome. Those bacteria are pretty hardworking, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah, I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think I read somewhere that we've actually got more bacterial cells than human cells. So we've actually got, we're more bacteria than we are human, or at least 50-50.
That's right. And of course, that's right. And as we know, what we put out at the other end of the digestive tract is essentially, I don't know how many people know this, but the matter that exits our bodies, I'm trying to be diplomatic, Doc, the stuff that exits our bodies, fecal matter, many people might not be aware of this, is essentially is bacteria. It's a stool. Essentially, is just a bulky form of bacteria, often dead bacteria that have achieved their purpose in life, breaking down some of our foods. These bacteria, in breaking down foods, produce various acids. And they produce, of course, gases. Now, those are gases you and I feel. We call it bloating, farting, etc.
Yeah.
Those are byproducts of the bacteria breaking down or assisting with the breaking down of our food. One of the products produced by bacteria acting on some of the food that we ingest, particularly a food component, fiber, which I want to talk a little bit about as well, if we can. Bacteria working on fiber produce an acid which in fact is anti-inflammatory.
Right.
And Lawrence, is an interesting correlation. We know that there's this inverse correlation between an inflammatory marker, CRP, C-reactive protein, that some people might be familiar with. Very simple blood test can measure the inflammation in the body by measuring CRP. And we know there's this inverse relationship between CRP and fiber. Fiber is very anti-inflammatory. And one of the reasons it is because our microbiome, which is something that we should be always working on, developing the healthiest possible microbiome we can through a good diet.
Yes.
When it acts on the fiber part of our diet, it produces these very positive acids. And that we understand now is one of the ways a diet can become anti-inflammatory. So fiber, and I'm happy to give you some examples, fiber can be incredibly, it is incredibly positive and is incredibly anti-inflammatory. Certain fibers in particular, and this on its own could be a large discussion, but I'll just, maybe just point to a few things. The fiber in things like fruits and vegetables. Right. The fibers found inside legumes are particularly beneficial.
Yes.
Fiber found in oats and other what we refer to as prebiotic foods. Prebiotic foods that allow for the development of a healthy microbiome. I'll give you some examples there. When you take bananas, for instance, an unripe banana is an incredible prebiotic food. Right. If you take potatoes and you cool them down, you eat them the following day, or you wait for them to become cold. That is an example of a wonderful prebiotic food, wonderful prebiotic fibers, which again encourage the development of a healthy microbiome. Now, just to try put this together a little bit, we know that there's a connection between, or should I say, the connection between mental health and diet occurs through this microbiome. We know that people might be familiar with this thing called the gut-brain axis.
Yes, and I remember you said to me earlier when we had a discussion that over 80% of the serotonin that's produced is produced in the gut, which I think
it's even over 90%. I think it's even over 90% of serotonin, which is, for those of you not familiar, the hormone that creates a happy sensation as opposed to a sad sensation. that happy hormone serotonin is which various drugs that people take to assist with their mood, of course, works on this chemical serotonin. So a lot of the serotonin is produced in the gut. So if we want to look after we focus so much on the heart. And we focus on the skin. People invest, I don't know how much money in things to put on their skin, to lather their skin, to make their skin look good, feel good, taste good, I don't know what. If we actually gave more attention to our diet, what goes in and what develops a healthy gut flora or microbiome, this could go a long way to developing, to assisting with moods and of course, wellness in general.
Yeah. Well, as I say, you are what you eat, right? Literally.
Yeah, that's right. And the science around the microbiome is starting to prove that.
Yeah. And I mean, because I think a lot of people think bacteria, then they think germs, because bacteria, traditionally, you think bugs and germs, but these bacteria are friendly bacteria and helpful. And so obviously we want to keep the best microbiome that we can. So is there a difference? Does everybody have a different microbiome? Are there certain bacteria that you want in your microbiome? And how do you encourage the growth of those bacteria? Number one.
Look, yeah, it's a great question, but it's a great question. And this is the problem. The problem is that we only at the footsteps of this particular pyramid. And so there's so much we don't understand. We're not yet at the point that we can actually say that, for instance, to develop a healthier cholesterol, or to develop or to improve one's mood, or to aid immune resilience, that one can eat a particular food that will help with the development of a particular bacteria that might help facilitate that process. We're not at that stage. We're in a tricky, I think we're at a difficult phase at the moment where we understand this connection between a healthy diet, some of the foods that we've spoken about, and others. I mean, I can mention so many very powerful anti-inflammatory healthy foods, and herbs and spices, turmeric, tea.
Coffee must be one, right? We have to have coffee in there. Coffee has to be.
Coffee as well, in moderation. And then, lots of other things, onions, pomegranates. There's some wonderful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory foods that we now know about that help to develop a healthy microbiome, but it's very difficult to pinpoint. To answer your that first question, we all have a very different microbiome. And those of us that share physical space with others might in fact also share a similar microbiome, which I personally think is a very interesting, we're going to gain some very interesting insights into this in the future. We already know that people that share a house or space with their animal friends, like dogs and cats, their microbiome for sure will be impacted on by and will be affected by the microbiome of some of the animals that they share space with. Right. And the same thing with people that share whatever intimate relationships. There's no question that there's so the microbiome is something that can change, and we know that it can change. We know what it's like to have a terribly upset gut when the balance of the microbiome is upset, and we're unable to digest food. We lose an appetite. We become very unwell, and sometimes people become critically unwell. Though there are people that are even not people. There are clinics, even in Australia, that try replace an individual's microbiome with another microbiome from another healthier individual.
Yes.
We actually transplant one microbiome for another, and it's quite an ugly subject to get into, but it is becoming very real. Just to share something what I think is quite funny, but it is quite real. I don't think it's available here in Australia that I'm aware of, but certainly in the States, you can even take You can even ingest other people's fecal matter to try colonize your gut with maybe, and these things are called crapsules.
Oh, don't try this at home, anyone.
Anyway, we'll change the subject.
Yes.
So it's a very, very exciting area that's going to be developing incredibly fast. What we now know, though, again, just to reiterate this point, is that a lot of our health is determined by the nature of what's going on in our large bowel. And if you think about it, how obvious is it that the nature of what goes on in our large bowel is impacted on by what we eat, which is what feeds the large bowel.
Yes.
So I think at least we're clearer now on how this connection between food and health exists, and particularly food and disease, through the introduction or the taking on more of an anti-inflammatory style of eating.
So let's just go through a few foods, as you said. I know you mentioned a couple, but like, what should people be aiming to get in their diet in terms of anti-inflammatory foods?
Right. A few things come to mind. I'll start maybe with the most obvious, and that's fruits and vegetables. Not only to be able to get fiber, which allows for the development of good bacteria and what they produce, but also because fruits and vegetables contain other ingredients, antioxidants like polyphenols, this incredible group of anti-inflammatory antioxidants. So fruits and vegetables, we have to put number one. And I always like to remind people that more vegetables than fruit, not the other way around. Yeah. As a general rule, we need to really focus on incorporating more vegetables in our diet. If we have very little vegetables and just a lot of fruit, we have a diet which becomes very carbohydrate heavy. We don't necessarily want that, so we try to focus more on vegetables. And it's been said that we should have at least double the weight in our diet of vegetables compared with fruit.
Yeah,
at least double the weight. So that's fruits and vegetables for the antioxidants, for the fiber, plant fiber. One thing really so important to mention, which it's easy to forget about when we talk about the microbiome and fiber, are oils. Because we know that oils can be incredibly anti-inflammatory, particularly monounsaturated fatty acids, MUFAs, olive oil, avocado.
Are these omega-3s that we're talking about now?
Right, no, omega-3s is separate actually. Okay. So when we think of our anti-inflammatory oils, we think of some of the MUFAs, the monounsaturated fatty acids like extra virgin olive oil. Yeah. One of the reasons that it's so anti-inflammatory is because extra virgin olive oil contains these polyphenol antioxidants. By the way, it's also what gives it the flavor.
Right.
So if you buy light so-called light olive oil is actually light in taste. People think it's light in oil sometimes. It's just light in taste, and that's because it's been stripped of the anti-inflammatory properties, these polyphenol antioxidants. Very important for people to know, to only buy extra virgin, good quality extra virgin olive oil. Now, so those are the MUFAs. Now, there's another type of oil, which is the omega-3 oil, which is not a monounsaturated oil. It's actually a polyunsaturated oil, right. But it's a good polyunsaturated oil. So that's the fish oils. Yes. And interesting that supplementing with fish oil is becoming, it's certainly gaining momentum, particularly in the area of, for instance, mental health specifically. There's growing research that increasing omega-3 essential fatty acids can be very helpful in this particular area. We're talking about fish largely, but there are other sources of omega-3 as well, like walnuts and flaxseed or flaxseed oil.
So I think I read a study that said, looking at fish oil, omega-3, particularly the EPA portion, that it increases serotonin. And there was a study done where I think they gave 2 grams of EPA a day, and the people who are on SSRIs, they could reduce their SSRIs by like almost 50% because of just by taking the EPA. So there's obviously
correct. I think there's even more powerful research to that shows that people that don't respond to antidepressant medication like they should, often respond quite well to the omega-3 fatty acids, specifically the one you mentioned, EPA. There are two essential fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids. One's EPA and the other one is DHA, and they seem to have some different advantages. But we try and include both of them in the diet. And if people look at their fish oil supplements, they'll see there's a breakdown of how much EPA and how much DHA. Unfortunately, a lot of commercially available supplements are pretty, the dose is pretty low, and I don't think is really of much therapeutic value. So it's worthwhile looking for an omega-3 that actually has a good dose of the actual EPA and DHA.
Yeah, and what would you be looking for in terms of a dose? How much EPA would you want, and how much DHA would you want, say, daily? Or
right, yeah, so at least 1.5 grams or 1,500 milligrams of EPA is probably what we should be aiming for. And if you look at as high as that, look at that might be towards the upper end, but it's a decent amount of EPA to get therapeutic benefit. Yeah. And if you look at most just commercially available over-the-counter fish oil supplements, one has to take, like 9 of these things, or 6 to 9 of these things, or maybe even more, to be able to get, say, 1,500 milligrams of EPA. So that's why it's worthwhile picking one that has a decent level of something like of EPA per capsule. I try and look for doses of around 400 to 500. Yes. 400 to 500 milligrams of EPA per capsule. Otherwise, I think one has to take too many of them. Yeah. And these are available. I won't mention brand names on this forum, but it's quite easy to ascertain, whether it's a low dose or high dose, just compared two products to each other. And
just, okay, so that's from a supplementation point of view, but in terms of our food, how do we increase the amount of omega-3 we get from our food?
Right. Well, it seems to require a decent intake of fish, and probably 3 to 4 times is what the research seems to point to. 3 to 4 times a week, 3 to 4 fish meals a week, to be able to get a decent dose of omega-3. But for people to actually get experience some therapeutic benefit, so in particularly areas of mental health, it probably actually requires supplemental. Right. There are ways around it, like having a couple of cans of sardines a day, where you would easily get, but most people struggle taking that into the workplace, particularly dentists.
Yeah,
dentists are very difficult having sardines for lunch. Preoperatively.
Definitely. So in terms of carrying on the supplementation route, what about supplementing with probiotics? Is there any value to that?
There's definitely increasing evidence that many people will benefit from taking probiotic supplements. My advice when looking at a probiotic, again, because as I said, we only at the footsteps of the pyramid. There's so much we don't understand. The safest thing is probably choosing a probiotic that has multiple strains of bacteria inside it, not choosing one that has 1 strain or 2 strains and that's claims to be beneficial for one particular ailment or for general gut health. I think one's safer off just choosing a probiotic that's got multiple strains, right. Perhaps at least 10 strains. And there are multiple products around that can achieve this. But yes, there is growing evidence that we can benefit from taking probiotics in our diet. It's early days to be able to say that everyone should take a probiotic and will benefit.
And what about, so in the diet itself, so having things like yogurt or fermented foods like sauerkraut and stuff like that, is that something that you could do?
Yeah, no, I think so. And so including some fermented foods, fermented drinks. Kombucha, correct. Yep, there's some wonderful flavors around. So including kombucha or dairy products that have been fermented as well. Yogurt is, of course, the classic example. There will be benefits there, which reminds me just to mention something else quite interesting. Dairy historically has had a bit of a bad rap and is very, very controversial. And perhaps it is a little bit controversial in some areas, but in the world of inflammation, you should know that there is growing evidence that dairy is perhaps not pro-inflammatory, but there is evidence to show that it's actually anti-inflammatory. Yeah. And so I think for many years, people have avoided dairy because of the controversy around it not being good for so many different ailments. And for sure, if you're allergic to dairy or you have severe lactose intolerance, I'm not encouraging anyone to have it in that situation. But if you tolerate dairy, there might be some anti-inflammatory benefit. So I'm just putting it out there. Again, you know, in my profession, every year, the opinion changes because we're learning so much so fast, but there is growing evidence that dairy might actually be anti-inflammatory, contrary to what so many people say.
Oh, it's good to know. I mean, when we're getting back to the yogurt story, obviously, like a lot of yogurts, you have a look at it and there's more sugar in there than anything else. So I'm assuming when you say yogurt, it's plain yogurt.
It is correct. It's plain yogurt. It's not vanilla yogurt. It's not berry yogurt. It's not mango yogurt. They do have an extremely high sugar content, a lot of yogurts. Often surprised when I look at the sugar load. We're referring to plain yogurts. And some kind of Greek style yogurt is what's generally recommended. The fat content probably doesn't make much of a difference. So you go with if you prefer something creamier, something thicker as opposed to lighter, it's a personal choice, but certainly one should go for something that is plain. In Australia, I think we're quite fortunate. We have a range of wonderful, quality yogurts to choose from. So that is one way to support a healthier microbiome as well, is to include some of these foods that naturally contain some good bacteria.
And as we said, I mean, obviously being a dentist, sugar is a huge part of my profession, and we the evil cousin, as you said. So we've got to look at sugar content of a lot of these things as well, right? Make sure we avoid that, and the processed foods, because
that's right. I think you've hit the nail on the head, and those are probably the two main things. It's probably sugar-rich products, drinks, and foods. Yes, one has to look at ingredient lists, but I think to most people, it's pretty obvious when we're consuming something which is sugar-rich in general. And I think at least equally importantly, to avoid things that are highly processed, and to come back to, to first principles, come back to basics, and have food that is as real as possible, as close to nature as possible. And, today we have, so many items on a supermarket shelf that never existed 50 years ago, and certainly not 100 years ago. So it's no wonder that, our health has also changed. Yeah.
No, definitely. So we just had a short coffee break. We're back with Mark, the nutritionist, and that actually just brings me a nice segue into coffee, because coffee, I love my coffee. I know there are some anti-inflammatory effects, and I know you mentioned polyphenols before in some of the vegetables, but I think there's some polyphenols in coffee as well, right?
Coffee has antioxidant properties, and coffee seems to have some really interesting benefits. Some of the studies actually come out of Monash, Melbourne, that show coffee protective against bowel cancer, against colorectal cancer.
That's amazing.
And so coffee is something that for many of us will be beneficial, I think, in moderation. And I'm going to call moderation a couple of cups of coffee a day.
Yeah.
And perhaps even up to 3. But there are many people that have 5, 10 cups of coffee, instant or real, and that might be a little bit of a little bit excessive. Yeah, everything in moderation, as the dietitians say.
Definitely. And I know we haven't really touched on protein at all. I wonder if you'd just like to speak about protein, possibly red meat in terms of inflammation, and then people following a plant-based diet, does that have a difference in terms of inflammation versus people who have, say, a more omnivorous diet?
It's people often ask, should I be ask me, should I be vegetarian, or should I consider lifting my game even further and becoming vegan? And I don't believe that everyone has to be vegetarian or vegan. However, they do have an advantage. And the advantage is that they focused on plant matter and they focused on fiber. And they, without a doubt, vegetarians and certainly vegans, at least the responsible vegans and the responsible vegetarians, responsible in terms of, being mindful of what they eat, would have a better intake of plant fibers than others that focus on a lot of flesh,
Right.
meat, fish, poultry. Meat is a little bit controversial. We know that fish is overwhelmingly beneficial and part of that Mediterranean diet again, and then supplies omega-3 oils, easier to digest form of protein, so easier on the digestive tract. Red meat is a little bit more controversial. It always has been. It's interesting. I often think back to a book that I read many years ago. It's called The Okinawa Way, which got me interested in nutrition, which is a group of geriatricians or gerontologists, a Canadian and I think a Japanese geriatrician as well, David Suzuki. There's a few David Suzukis around, but one David Suzuki. And they did a study over many, many years looking at the secret to one of these blue zones, the Okinawa Islands off the coast of Japan, and why they experience such good longevity and quality of life as well, not just a long life, but a high quality of life. And I remember finding it interesting when I read that they don't avoid meat.
Right.
However, the meat that they have is the size of a small little matchbox. It was something along those lines.
Right,
Probably believe that I'm not quoted on that, but it was something similar to that. They include meat, but they have very small amounts of meat in their diet, and more of they derive protein more from other sources like plant-based sources like legumes,
right.
I'm not sure if they have lentils specifically, but just giving some examples of legumes like lentils, tofu, which is derived from the soybean.
Yes.
Great source of protein, and of course they fish for fish.
Yes.
So the protein is important. One of the reasons protein is important is actually a very practical reason. And that is, it's protein that allows us to feel satiated, to feel satisfied. Yeah. It's protein that tells the body when to stop eating.
Right.
On a pure carbohydrate diet, people struggle with when to stop.
Yes.
So I think this is one advantage of protein. Now, this, again, doesn't mean that one is to eat meat, fish, or chicken. It might just make it a little bit easier in terms of weight management to include it. Having said that, whether one chooses to be a vegetarian or vegan is a personal choice, which we all have to respect. There are multiple reasons that people choose to go vegetarian and vegan, and it's not only around health. There are other also ethical reasons and very sound arguments. But I think it's a personal choice, and we all need to respect each other's choices. There's no question that we need many of us need to have more plant fiber in our diet.
Yeah.
And that supports a vegetarian vegan case. And there is evidence that many of us eat too much red meat and too often. We need to reduce our intake of red meat. There is a cutoff. We think that a red meat intake of greater than about 450 grams a week, it's rounded off to 500 grams. 500 grams a week might increase risk of colorectal cancer. But lower than that, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't seem to be associated with bowel cancer.
Now, where does chicken fall into this? I know you lump chicken and red meat together, or would chicken be a different kind of protein source?
It would be a different protein. It would be a different protein source. That's a good question. The evidence that suggests that red meat, particularly red meat in excess, which seems to be a red meat intake of over 500 grams a week, which is not a lot for a typical Australian meat eater at all.
Yeah.
It's what one would have in one serving probably.
Yeah.
And the people that have red meat five nights a week, and they have about that amount. So you can understand, appreciate how much red meat we are consuming, and
Yes.
might not be a good thing. Chicken is different, and there isn't this correlation between chicken and colorectal cancer or bowel cancer as there is with red meat. There are, and I just don't know enough about this, but there are other concerns around chicken and the way the meat is, or the way the chickens are managed, handled, whether they are injected with chemicals that might have consequences further on down the track. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, the chicken came first. But we want to talk about the chicken and the egg. So we talked about the chicken first. So the chicken came first. But let's get back to eggs, because that's another controversial thing. I know we discussed dairy, and you said dairy is very good and actually anti-inflammatory. What about eggs? I know.
Eggs are overwhelmingly very good. Egg whites is a very clean source of protein of a very high biological value, meaning when the body requires protein, something like egg white would provide the body with what it needs. The egg yolk is filled with antioxidants, and which explains the bright color of the yolk of an egg. It's filled with antioxidants, and some of them are wonderful for instance, the eyes, like lutein, and other benefits as well. The controversy around eggs is quite almost a fairly complete meal in some ways. The controversy has always been around the yolk and the cholesterol content, because egg yolks are fairly concentrated in cholesterol. But we believe that the cholesterol inside the yolk of an egg derived from a chicken doesn't really feed human cholesterol swimming around in our bloodstream. And if anything, what increases our cholesterol levels, well, as many of us know, there's often a genetic component to it. Our liver produces more cholesterol than it needs to, and that's often genetically driven. But the fat inside certain foods, saturated fat, is also thought to contribute towards cholesterol buildup. But Lawrence, that itself is becoming a little bit controversial, where the saturated fats that were once thought of as being bad are in fact not bad at all, and might be somewhere between neutral and actually good. When I say that, everyone needs to appreciate that I'm not talking about processed saturated fat. I'm talking about saturated fat found naturally occurring inside a fresh piece of meat, or inside some dairy. And of course, there are plant forms of saturated fat as well, like coconut oil, coconut fat. That's appear to be somewhere between either neutral or even positive in the effect, but probably not bad like we once thought saturated fats were. There is a little bit of controversy still there, so we might have to wait another 5 to 10 years to speak with absolute conviction, but it seems to be moving in that direction.
So it's a tick for eggs then. Eggs are on the menu.
It is, yeah. In my opinion, it's a tick for eggs. But I say that always being mindful that there are people out there that choose not to have eggs for various reasons, such as vegans. But from a objective nutritional perspective, I think it's a nourishing food.
Great. And then in terms of protein supplementation, what is your view on, say, protein powders, supplementing protein that way?
It's very few people need to supplement with protein. Most of us have enough protein from our diets, and that includes vegetarians. But there are times where we look at someone's diet, and particularly someone that needs additional protein for healing purposes. Protein is critical for healing and rehabilitation. or someone that needs extra protein because they are trying to build muscle mass, they in fact might need a little bit of extra protein, and they might find it difficult deriving it from the diet. And that's where protein in the form of a protein powder, like for instance a whey protein isolate as an example, might be beneficial. But there's also a lot of teenagers out there supplementing with protein that are probably just overdosing on protein by taking powders on top of a normal diet with more than adequate protein levels. So it's an individual thing.
Okay, fantastic. So this has been a really fascinating talk. Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to just say in closing, and a few tips for the audience, just some take homes?
I think at the end of the day, when thinking of inflammation or just thinking of healthy eating in general, it's using this term I used a few minutes ago. It's about coming back to first principles. It's about trying to eat a diet which is as real as possible, which includes products that are as close to nature as possible, reducing our intake of sugar or sugar dense products, ensuring that we get plenty of vegetables in our diet, and a variety of types and a variety of colors. Trying to
control the vegetable, you want as many colors as you can, right?
You do, because it's the color of a vegetable reflects what's going on inside. It tells us something about its antioxidant profile. So two vegetables, two different colors, we can assume contain different antioxidants. And that's the reason that our grandparents and great-grandparents pushed a variety of colors of vegetables. Somehow they knew about this.
That's good stuff, yeah. Definitely.
And that's a very important tip. Oh, just one more.
Yeah.
To remain well hydrated. If we
I was just going to say that. What about hydration? Yeah.
Yeah. If we're going to round off nutrition, I should remind people that a working gut needs to be well hydrated. Expecting food to travel through the gut and expecting food to be digested effectively without water is like taking tissue paper and shoving it in a hose pipe and expecting it to come through the other end without turning on the tap.
Yes.
That's the analogy people should think of. So remaining hydrated is critical for health and for a healthy gut.
But when you say hydration, you're talking water, not fizzy drinks, and not.
No, I'm not talking. No, correct. Yeah, I'm talking water, but I'm also thinking of teas, which also happen to be anti-inflammatory, because teas are rich in anti-inflammatories and antioxidants specifically.
Yes.
So I'm thinking of water. I'm thinking of teas. I'm thinking of some chicken soup at the moment.
Chicken soup.
Pretty cold out there.
Yeah.
We're thinking predominantly of water.
Water. Yeah, and as you say, teas are antioxidant and also really, really good source of hydration as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Teas, herbal teas, and a variety of different teas are powerful sources. Some teas contain caffeine, and some teas are naturally caffeine-free. Right, I drink a tea that you might be familiar with called Rooibos.
Yes. Very high in antioxidants.
Very high in antioxidants and naturally caffeine-free, and that's just one wonderful example. But there's lots of teas available, and I encourage people to drink more tea, especially this time of year.
And how much liquid should we be taking in during a day? So,
right. Well, there is a formula that applies.
Yeah.
And for most people, most adults, it's somewhere between 2 and 3 liters that it adds up to. It's weight dependent, but it's somewhere around 2 to 3 liters for the majority of people. However, and most people would be familiar with that, but that load includes things like yogurts, and it includes if someone has a diet that's quite high in fruit. There's a lot of water inside fruit, as we know. Think of fresh fruit and compare it with a dehydrated, dried version of fruit, and you'll see the difference in size. There's a lot of water inside fresh fruit, and that's included in that amount. So for most people, I find if one is drinking some teas and having a diet rich in fruits and vegetables and maybe some other forms of liquid, some yogurt comes in, etc. If we're having around a liter of water on top of that, we're probably doing okay.
Yes.
You're probably doing okay. And there are some people that are driven to drink much more than that. And if your body tells you that you need 2 or 3 liters, that's great. And if your body tells you that you need 10 liters, you might need to get yourself checked out, because there is such a thing as diluting your one's electrolytes, which can be actually quite dangerous. And this is well documented. It's seen in ultra endurance athletes that actually overhydrate and overdilute the electrolytes in their bloodstream, and it can have, catastrophic consequences. So somewhere between, a liter plus of water is acceptable for most people. I don't think we need to all be pushing for 2 liters of water every single day, particularly in these cold months.
Right. Mark, thank you very much. It's been absolutely amazing having you on. I really appreciate it. Just for the audience, tell everyone where they can find you on social, on the internet, and IRL, or in real life.
Thanks. I'm easy to track down. The Nutritionist, one word. If you look me up, I also come under the name Dietitian Man. So look for Dietitian Man, or look for the Nutritionist.
That's your superhero handle. You just open the shirt, Dietitian Man, to the rescue.
I love it. Yeah. I found it a few years ago, so I use that one as well. I'm quite easy to find on social media, and I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm still passionate about what I do after 26 years of doing
that. Fantastic. And I'll link Mark's details in the comments below. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll catch you guys on the next episode. Speak to you soon. Have a great day. Cheers.